Pax vobiscum. Welcome back to the channel, and to another episode of The Vestal Virgin Reads. Today we will be diving into a book that I've been interested in reading for some time. The book is Character, the Grandest Thing in the World, written by one Orison Swett Marden. Now, this book was originally published in 1899, which excites me, and the reason it is exciting to read books from more than a century ago is that it provides us with a snapshot into another time and world. That being said, as we examine this writing, we will also look into references and issues that it discusses, and I ask that we all listen and ponder with an open mind. Human beings may always be human beings, but how we view things can change. I believe it is firmly possible to understand and observe another's perspective without necessarily agreeing with them. And now with that, sort of disclaimer, if you will, let's move on to the book itself. And as I mentioned, this book was originally published in 1899. I came across this book through the pages of another book I'd been reading recently, and as part of my personal quest to seek truth in sources, I wrote it down in my book journal. And my goal is to write down articles, books, or any other such media referenced in works that I'm currently reading, and then read them for myself. So I have a notebook that whenever I find, another book mentioned, I'll write it down in there, and once I finish the book I'm reading, move on to the next one, and as you can imagine, my list has grown quite long. But be that as it may, enter Character, the Grandest Thing in the World. So this book is split into 9 chapters, or sections really, and is considered one of the first sort of self-help books as we know it today, particularly in America. And to set the stage even further, I'd like to talk about the author himself briefly. So Orison Swett Marden had a rather interesting life, and one that we will dive deeper into at the concluding episode of this book discussion, so once we sort of make it through all 9 chapters, we'll talk about him a bit more. But for now, we'll sort of take a general look at his life, and it is filled with sadness and triumph in equal measure, I would say. So, Marden was born 11 June 1848 in New Hampshire. He has 2 siblings, he had, 2 siblings, 2 sisters, which I believe he was the elder one. And when he was only 3 years old, unfortunately, his mother tragically passed away, leaving them under the care of their father. And unfortunately, tragedy struck yet again when his father, who was a hunter and trapper, died from injuries he suffered while out in the woods. At the time, Orison was only 7 years old. So at the loss of their parents, Orison and his sisters were essentially passed around from guardian to guardian, while Orison would work odd jobs wherever they were to support them. Now, despite all this, Orison was determined to go to college, and go he did. He supported himself through several degrees and studies, including science, art, medicine, and law. And while in college, he worked at hotels, and eventually he even owned a few hotels himself, including a resort. And it was actually in one of these hotels that he almost lost his life. So when he was 44, he was staying in one of his own hotels when a massive fire broke out, and he was barely able to escape with his life and forced to watch as one of his hotels burned down. And what is even worse, unfortunately, in his hotel room he had just finished the manuscript for his very first book, and of course he cared more about his life, so he leapt out the window, and unfortunately his manuscript went up in flames too, which is highly unfortunate, but unswayed, he swiftly rewrote the entire manuscript and published it. So he also went on, after this, he wrote several more books. He also founded a magazine called Success Magazine in 1897, and the latter half of his life were his more authorial years, so that's when he really started to write more versus focusing on the hotels and such. And the books and articles that he wrote were lauded by many successful individuals, including Henry Ford and Carnegie, I do believe. So, let's see here. Yes, and then he passed away March 10th, 1924 at the age of 75. And that information was pulled from the Wikipedia page devoted to Orison Swett Marden. So the overview of Orison Swett Marden's life, I feel, is an important aspect of his own character, his writing, maybe highlights a little bit of understanding for his passion for writing and for self-help. I feel that it is important to sort of understand the author a little bit before we start reading his work. And with that being said, now that we've introduced you all to the author, let us be introduced to his work as well, beginning with Chapter 1. A Grand Character. Chapter 1. A Grand Character. If Drummond was wise in calling an abstract quality, love, the greatest thing in the world, then love in the concrete, embodied in character, is the grandest thing in the world. Drummond himself in his life story is far grander than anything he ever wrote, for he was the life of a radiant personality. You met him, says Dr. George Adam Smith, his biographer, a graceful, well-dressed gentleman, tall and lithe, with a swing in his step and a brightness in his face, who seemed to carry no cares and to know neither presumption nor timidity. You spoke and found him keen for any of 100 interests. He fished, he shot, he skated, as few can. He played cricket. He would go any distance to see a fire or a football match. He had a new story or a new puzzle or a new joke every time he met you. Was it on the street? He drew you to watch two messenger boys meet, grin, knock each other's hat off, lay down their baskets, and enjoy a friendly chaffer at marbles. Was it on the train? He read you a fresh tale of his favorite, Bret Harte. Was it a rainy afternoon in a country house? He described a new game, and in 5 minutes everybody was in the thick of it. If it was a children's party, they clamored for his sleight of hand. Drummond as a boy was manly, and as a man he carried a boy's heart in his breast. The Prince, he was called by the young men who knew him. He had a genius for friendship, says Professor Gross. He so won the affection of working men that one said, after Drummond died, that he almost felt as if he must pray to him, to invoke his influence for good from out of the heavenly realms. His influence, says Ian McLaren, who first knew Drummond as a boy on the cricket field, more than that of any other man I ever met, was mesmeric, which means that, while other men affect their fellows by speech and example, he seized one directly by his living personality. Quite sensible and unromantic people grew very uneasy in his presence, and roused themselves to resistance, as one might do who recognized a magician and feared his spell. Men were at once arrested, interested, fascinated by the very sight of the man, and could not take their eyes off of him. It was as if the prince of one's imagination had dropped in amongst the common folk. He was the youth who sprang to the aid of Moody and Sankey in the Scottish stronghold, who caught hold of young men and persuaded them in untechnical phrase to do what their praying mothers on earth and God Most High would have them do. The quiet, unrestrained evangelist, not 23, about whom all men gathered as their leader when the American evangelists left Scotland. A stalwart theologian, too, was he, who detected the natural laws that were at work in the spiritual world. A thinker, simple, clear, presenting truth in the concrete. He, too, was the explorer plunging into the wilds of Africa, without giving a thought to a bookmaker's fame. And while 250,000 people were reading his books, he was crowding along the work of the hour at the world's end in America or Australia. How eagerly men sought him, clung to him, and followed him as he followed the Master. Do we ask, what is character? Is it not that sum of qualities which distinguishes one person from another? Do we say that Drummond's versatility was his distinguishing characteristic? It was rather his unique combination of high qualities, and no man can acquire a far-reaching influence without a fair mental balance, with great strength upon many sides. If it is no part of my intent in this booklet to catalogue those mental and moral traits of most value to mankind, yet it is my intent to name certain deep-rooted dispositions which are essential in the mental make-up of those who set before themselves a high ideal in seeking for the grandest thing in the world. Well, as you heard, this particular chapter was very short, and as we can see is more of an introduction, rather than a chapter per se. Now, what is rather interesting in these 3 pages is that Marden provides us an example of the type of character that he means to sort of explain a bit more in the rest of the book. And just for a little bit of background, this man that he provides as almost the quintessential example is a man called Henry Drummond, who was a Scottish evangelist who just so happened to write a sermon titled "Love, the Grandest Thing in the World." And Marden makes reference to this sermon by stating that if love is the grandest abstract, character is the grandest concrete, and it would seem that his example of Henry Drummond is of a man who seems to have the embodiment of the abstract and the concrete. And to sort of highlight that, to quote 2 examples on page 6, that Drummond was mesmeric, which means that while other men affect their fellows by speech and example, he seized on directly by his living personality, and that he was a thinker, simple, clever, presenting truth in the concrete. And so we see again that Henry Drummond matches the concrete and the abstract, the personality, the living personality, and the thinker, the clever presenting truth. And then Marden goes on to ask, what is character? And he puts forward that character really, at its core, are certain qualities that separate one person from another. A combination of things that is unique, but yet can be found across many people. And I find this to be an interesting proposal, the concept that character is a rare thing, a beautiful thing, a grand thing, and that many can have character, and yet it is a unique thing for one to have. So an interesting proposal by Marden, and I'm very curious to see what other examples he has for us in future pages for character. So this is a shorter video for a shorter book, but this is the sort of format I'd like to use going forward for these types of videos. The focus of such videos will be to bring forward books to add to your arsenals, and to foster discussion of topics and concepts, and to further sort of dig our heels into history and learn about those who came before us. So far, I will say even just doing some reading of Orison Swett Marden, and even doing a little bit of digging into Henry Drummond himself, I'm very excited later on to do a video talking just about them and what made them sort of reach the conclusions that they did. In relation to this book, I should say. So I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one, where we will be discussing Chapter 2 of the book, Character, the Grandest Thing in the World. Pax vobiscum. Goodbye.